year was 1884, in the bustling heart of Austin, Texas, a city eager to prove itself as the proud capital of a growing state. By day, the streets echoed with the sound of horse-drawn wagons, the chatter of merchants, and the ringing of hammers as new buildings rose in the skyline. Oil lamps flickered along Congress Avenue, and the newly completed state capitol dome glittered in the sunlight. It was an age of ambition, a time when Texas sought to shed its frontier past and embrace the promise of modernity. But when night fell, shadows gathered differently in Austin. Behind the neat rows of houses and hotels, whispers began to stir about something stalking the city after dark. It was not the familiar threats of cattle thieves or drunken brawls. No, this was darker, quieter, and far less understood. Within the city's African-American quarters, fear had begun to grow, though few outside those neighborhoods yet cared to listen. On a cold December night in 1884, the illusion of safety would shatter. A young servant girl was found brutally slain behind her small wooden home. The newspapers called it a shocking tragedy. But to those who lived in the shadows of Austin, it was something worse. The beginning of a reign of terror that would last for nearly a year. And so, dear listener, I invite you into this story not as a distant observer, but as a participant in a haunting investigation that has lingered unsolved for more than a century. Before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment with your city and the exact time you are hearing these words. Are you in the daylight, or has night already fallen where you are? Imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to walk those dimly lit Austin streets in 1884, not knowing if the footsteps behind you belonged to a friend or to something else entirely. This is the story of the Servant Girl Annihilator, a figure who haunted Austin long before the city was known for its music, its festivals, or its modern skyline. A killer who left the city trembling, whose crimes forced society to confront its deepest fears, and whose identity remains cloaked in shadows to this day. The December air in Austin was sharp that year, cold enough to bite through thin clothing. In the early hours of December 30th, 1884, a chilling discovery was made near the home of a young African-American servant girl named Molly Smith. She was just in her early 20s, a woman of quiet routines, known for her hard work in one of the white households near the city's edge. Her body was found just outside her small cabin, lying in the dirt behind the yard. She had been dragged from her bed in the dead of night, and her skull bore the crushing marks of a heavy blow. An axe, the most common of household tools, had been wielded as a weapon. Her clothes were torn, and the brutality of the act went far beyond anything the city had seen in recent memory. What unsettled the neighbors most was the silence that had surrounded her death. No one heard a struggle, no cries pierced the night. The killer had entered, taken her, and vanished again with unnerving ease. The newspapers, still cautious, described the incident as a most lamentable outrage. To the white population of Austin, it was a passing shock, another crime in a growing city. But in the city's black quarters, the story carried a different weight. Servants whispered of a shadow that came in the night, a figure that seemed to choose women like Molly, those who lived in small cabins on the fringes of white households, unprotected, unseen. The police investigation was clumsy and brief. Officers questioned neighbors, examined Molly's cabin, but found little evidence to pursue. There was no forced entry, no footprints, clearly leading away in the hard ground. The city sheriff suggested it might have been the work of a drunken vagrant or a jealous suitor. Yet, beneath that thin explanation, the sense of dread began to take root. For the first time, women in Austin began bolting their doors at night, and husbands kept a closer eye on their homes. But still, few believed it would happen again. They were wrong. The shock of Molly Smith's murder did not fade with the turning of the year. If anything, it lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. By February of 1885, whispers spread through the quarters, stories of footsteps in the night, doors creaking open, and figures moving silently between the shadows of the small servant cabins. At first, people dismissed them as rumors born of fear. But then came another attack. Eliza Shelley, another black servant woman, was assaulted in her home. She survived, but the blow that left her skull fractured revealed the same hand at work. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing until her screams rang out, and even then, the figure had vanished before anyone could respond. Soon after, another servant, Irene Cross, was struck with such violence that those who saw her wounds whispered of something more savage than human. She lived for a brief time after the attack, but her testimony was confused and broken. She spoke of a tall figure moving like a shadow, of a sharp blade glinting in the lamplight. Then she fell silent forever. Each time, the pattern was the same. A woman alone at night, dragged from her bed, or struck as she lay sleeping. The weapon always some common household tool, an axe, a knife, or a heavy club. The killer seemed to vanish into the night without leaving a trace, slipping through neighborhoods as if he knew every back path and every quiet lane of the city. The African-American community began to live in constant dread. Families barred their doors and gathered together at night, refusing to let their daughters or wives sleep alone. Men kept watch with lanterns and rifles, forming small patrols in hopes of deterring the shadow that seemed to haunt their streets. Yet, despite these efforts, the attacks continued. Each new victim deepened the conviction that Austin was being stalked not by a drunkard or jealous lover, but by something far worse, a predator, with no clear motive beyond destruction itself. The name had not yet been coined, but the figure who would come to be called the Servant Girl Annihilator was already shaping the darkest chapter in Austin's history. By the spring of 1885, Austin was living in two separate worlds. On one side of town, the sound of fiddles carried through open windows, as the city's wealthier families held evening dances in parlors lit by chandeliers. Politicians met in the newly built halls of the capital, proud of Austin's reputation as a city of refinement and promise. To the public eye, Austin was a symbol of progress, a beacon of Texas modernity. Yet, across the river and in the narrow lanes of the servants' quarters, a different sound dominated the night. The muffled cries of grief, the hushed prayers of frightened families, and the sharp crack of rifles fired into the darkness by men who feared the shadow lurking outside their doors. The divide was stark. While African-American households grieved and braced themselves against the unseen predator, many in the city's white community dismissed the violence as isolated misfortunes. The newspapers, cautious about unsettling their readers, reported the killings in clipped, restrained language. They labeled them outrages or unfortunate occurrences, as if they were little more than accidents of urban life. But the servants knew better. They whispered that the attacks followed a rhythm, that the killer watched and waited for the right moment. Some believed he slipped into cabins while families slept, moving so quietly that even dogs failed to bark. Others claimed he used some drug or charm to silence his victims before the first blow was struck. Whatever the method, the result was always the same. Another woman wounded or gone, another family shattered, and as the attacks mounted, tensions spilled over. Husbands and fathers patrolled the streets with lanterns, their shadows stretching across fences and dirt lanes. Rumors grew of vigilantes ready to catch the murderer themselves, since the law seemed unable or unwilling to act. Austin, though outwardly thriving, was becoming a city built on fear. By daylight, laughter and commerce filled its avenues. By nightfall, the silence of dread hung over entire neighborhoods, a silence broken only when the next victim was found. The violence did not fade with the warming weather. If anything, it grew bolder. By the early summer of 1885, the killer's attacks had taken on a far more chilling character. It was no longer only about striking women as they slept. There was something deliberate, something that suggested cruelty beyond mere impulse. On May 6, 1885, the community awoke to news of another brutal assault. Eliza Shelley, a young servant working in a respectable home, was found dead in her quarters. Her skull had been split with the same terrible precision seen in earlier cases. Her employer described the attack in hushed tones, horrified that such savagery had happened so close to their own doorstep. Just weeks later, Irene Cross, another black servant, was struck down with such violence that even the police, hardened to crime, seemed shaken by what they saw. Survivors who glimpsed her after the attack refused to speak of it for long, muttering that her wounds were not of this earth. The killer was no longer content to kill quickly. He was inflicting terror, mutilating his victims in ways that suggested a mind that took grim satisfaction in the act. Each new death silenced the city's reassurances. This was no random spree of drunken violence. The pattern was undeniable now. A predator who chose his victims carefully, striking under the cover of night, wielding everyday tools like axes and knives with deadly intent. In the poorer neighborhoods, the fear deepened into a kind of paralysis. Women huddled in groups at night, refusing to sleep alone. Men gathered with rifles and dogs, searching the alleys and creek beds, but they found nothing. The killer moved too swiftly, too silently. It was as if he knew the city better than the city knew itself. The police struggled to keep order. Patrols were increased. Curfews were whispered about, but none of it stopped the killing. The newspapers grew louder in their coverage, their restrained tone giving way to panic-laced headlines. "Is Austin haunted by a midnight fiend?" one broadsheet asked. The answer, at least in the minds of the city's residents, was yes, Austin was being hunted. With each new assault, the city demanded answers. Surely someone must have seen the figure that moved through Austin's streets at night. And in fact, there were witnesses too many, in fact, and none who agreed on what they had seen. One survivor, a shaken young woman who lived in the servants' quarters near Pecan Street, insisted she had seen a tall white man, his features hidden by a broad hat. She said he moved with purpose, slipping away before she could scream. Her account was taken seriously by some, for it challenged the assumption that the violence was confined to the poorer black neighborhoods. Yet another woman, older and living in a different part of town, told the police she had glimpsed a black laborer, a man of imposing size, vanishing into the night after a sudden noise in the yard. Others swore the attacker was a foreigner, perhaps a Mexican, or even an immigrant from farther abroad, someone who did not belong to the city's familiar population. The contradictions grew maddening. Each description added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another with unease. In a city already strained by racial and social divides, the killer's anonymity widened every fault line. White citizens began to demand stricter control over black workers, while black communities accused the police of negligence and bias, arguing that they had been sounding alarms long before the white victims appeared. The police found themselves overwhelmed. Without clear evidence, they could not act decisively. They arrested men on flimsy suspicions, only to release them days later when no proof emerged. Each failure emboldened the belief that the killer was beyond the reach of law, that he could be anyone and no one. Rumors grew wilder. Some whispered that the murderer was not one man but several, a secret society carrying out rituals in the dark. Others said it was something supernatural, a creature that could change its shape, explaining the different descriptions. What remained certain was this: the killer was watching, and he would strike again. And this time, the violence would not remain contained in the quarters. The city was dressed for the season. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1885, families gathered for midnight services. Children hung stockings by the fire, and the streets of Austin were quiet beneath a cold winter sky. But while the city celebrated, the Annihilator struck with a fury that would shatter whatever illusions of safety remained. That night, 2 women were murdered within hours of each other, both of them members of Austin's white community. The first was Susan Hancock, a refined woman in her 40s, known for her kindness and her place among the city's respectable families. She was found in her yard, savagely attacked with an axe, her body bearing the same dreadful marks as the servant women who had come before her. The second was Eula Phillips, just 17 years old, the young wife of a prominent man in the city. She was killed in her home, her body discovered with wounds so brutal that even seasoned officers were shaken. In her case, the violence went beyond mere murder. It seemed personal, as if the killer had sought not only to destroy life, but to leave behind a spectacle of horror. The 2 deaths, so close in time and place, plunged the city into panic. Until then, many among Austin's white elite had dismissed the killings as tragedies confined to the servant quarters, tragedies that, however terrible, did not touch their own circles. But on Christmas Eve, the illusion collapsed. The Annihilator had crossed boundaries, proving that no one was beyond his reach. The shock reverberated through every household. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men kept revolvers at hand even at church services. The newspapers abandoned cautious language, calling the killer a fiend in human shape and demanding immediate justice. Christmas Day in Austin should have been a time of joy. Instead, it was marked by fear, grief, and outrage. The Annihilator had chosen the holiest night of the year to to deliver his most terrible message. There would be no safe corner in this city. Not for the poor, not for the wealthy, not for anyone. The morning after Christmas in Austin was not filled with hymns or celebration, but with headlines written in black ink across the city's newspapers. "Murder most foul, in the capital city," one declared. Another printed a single word in large type across its front page. Annihilator, the term stuck. From that day forward, the unknown figure stalking Austin was no longer just a killer. He was the Servant Girl Annihilator, a name as chilling as the crimes themselves. The press, which had once chosen cautious language, now spilled ink in torrents of panic. Reporters described the city as under siege, claiming that no household could be considered safe. They recounted the brutality in lurid detail, sparing no reader from the shock. Fear sold papers, and the Annihilator's deeds were the darkest kind of news. City leaders felt the pressure immediately. Mayor John Robertson faced angry crowds demanding answers. The police force, already stretched thin, was publicly denounced as incompetent. Detectives scoured the city night after night, but the killer always seemed one step ahead. Suspicion fell on strangers passing through, on drifters, on immigrants. Each arrest was announced with fanfare, but each release brought deeper embarrassment. The violence had done more than spill blood. It had exposed the fragility of Austin's promise as a modern city. How could a capital that prided itself on progress and refinement harbor such savagery in its streets? How could lawmakers build a shining new Capitol dome while their citizens barricaded doors against an invisible predator? The dissonance was sharp. Public meetings were called, sermons thundered from pulpits, and men patrolled neighborhoods with shotguns. For every official assurance that order would be restored, the whispers of terror only deepened. By the start of 1886, Austin was no longer merely uneasy. It was a city consumed by dread. Its people convinced that the Annihilator could strike at any hour, in any home, and that the authorities were powerless to stop him. By the first weeks of 1886, investigators tried to bring order to the chaos by assembling what scraps of evidence they had. One fact stood out immediately: the weapons. In nearly every case, the killer had used tools that were not exotic or rare, but common implements found in every household: axes, knives, iron rods. The simplicity was itself unnerving. The killer never needed to carry a weapon into the night. He could simply take what was at hand, wielding it with devastating skill. Then there was the timing. Almost all of the attacks occurred deep in the night, often just before dawn. The city lay quiet, the lamps burned low, and most households were asleep. Neighbors rarely heard more than a muffled cry, if anything at all, before the silence returned. The killer seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, so that no one could come to the victim's aid. The targets added another dimension. For months, it had been exclusively servant women, mostly young, and living on the fringes of white households. But after Christmas Eve, that pattern had broken. Wealthy women were now among the dead. Did that mean the Annihilator's appetite had grown bolder? Or had it always been wider, only now visible to the whole city? Theories multiplied. Some detectives insisted it was the work of a single predator, a man who lived among them, moving unseen through the alleys and side streets. Others argued it might be a group, a circle of men, or even a secret society, carrying out ritualized violence under the cover of darkness. Among ordinary citizens, the rumors grew stranger still. Some whispered it was a foreigner, a wandering sailor or soldier who had slipped into the city unnoticed. Others spoke of darker forces, claiming no ordinary man could move so silently or strike with such cruelty. There were even mutterings of witchcraft, or of a werewolf, an idea born less of evidence than of desperation. The only certainty was uncertainty. Every theory opened more questions than it answered, and with each passing night, the people of Austin waited in dread for the next blow. The hunt for the Annihilator led to a long parade of suspects, each one seized upon by a desperate public hungry for resolution. But as quickly as the arrests came, they fell apart, leaving Austin even more uneasy. One of the first serious suspects was a black laborer who worked near the homes of two of the victims. He was arrested with great fanfare, the newspapers hailing the police for their diligence. But when no evidence tied him to the crimes, and when he could not be placed at the scenes, the case dissolved. He was released in silence, and the fear returned louder than before. Soon after, attention turned to a white coachman, a man employed by one of the wealthier families. He was known for his heavy drinking and violent temper, and whispers claimed he had quarreled with servants in the past. He too was arrested, interrogated, and even briefly held in jail. Yet again, the facts refused to align. No blood, no stolen items, no confession, nothing. He was set free, and suspicions shifted elsewhere. There was even a moment when a prominent local politician fell under suspicion. He was rumored to have been seen near one of the crime scenes late at night, and his reputation for secret affairs made him an easy target for gossip. The police questioned him discreetly, but the matter was quietly dropped. The idea that a man of influence could be involved was too scandalous to pursue openly. Each new suspect brought hope, and each release brought despair. The people began to feel mocked by their own lawmen. For every announcement of progress, the reality proved hollow. By the middle of 1886, the city was awash in suspicion. Neighbors watched each other warily. Employers eyed their servants, and servants whispered about their masters. Every shadow might conceal the killer. Every stranger's glance seemed to carry menace. The Annihilator had done more than kill. He had sown distrust so deeply into Austin's fabric that the city itself seemed to turn against its own people. By the middle of 1886, Austin was a city divided not just by race and class, but by the invisible pressure of fear. The killings had transformed daily life. Streets that once bustled at night now fell silent after sunset. Families who could afford it hired armed watchmen to stand guard over their homes. In the poorer quarters, neighbors gathered in groups, carrying lanterns and shotguns, patrolling in shifts until dawn. Yet the vigil did little to ease the tension. The Annihilator always seemed to move elsewhere, striking where the lantern light did not reach. Each new attack proved that no watch was foolproof, no rifle quick enough. It was as if the city itself had become a maze in which the killer moved freely, while everyone else stumbled in fear. The social fabric strained. The white elite, finally shaken after the deaths of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, demanded swift action. Many called for harsher policing of the black community, convinced that the killer must be hidden among the very servants who were being slaughtered. Meanwhile, in those same communities, bitterness grew. Families who had buried their daughters whispered that the city had ignored their cries until white women fell victim. The divisions were laid bare. At church services, ministers thundered about sin and divine punishment. At taverns, men shouted about conspiracies and foreign threats. Even in the halls of the capital, lawmakers muttered that Austin's reputation was in peril. How could a city meant to lead Texas into the modern age be known instead as the home of a midnight butcher? And beneath all of it, the same dread remained. The fear of footsteps behind one's door, of a shadow slipping across the yard, of a sudden blow in the dark. Austin had grown in wealth and ambition, but its citizens were learning that progress could not keep out fear. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the terror ceased. By the end of the summer of 1886, Austin's nights grew strangely quiet. The killings that had haunted the city for nearly a year stopped without warning. No more midnight cries, no more gruesome discoveries in the yards and alleys. The abrupt silence puzzled everyone. Some believed the killer had finally been captured on some lesser charge, locked away for theft or drunken violence, his true deeds unknown to the court. Others whispered he had fled the city, sensing that suspicion was closing in, vanishing down the same roads that had brought him here. A darker rumor spread that he had died, perhaps lynched in secret, or perhaps struck down by fate itself. Whatever the reason, the murders were over. Yet their echo lingered. Families that had once bolted doors now continued the habit out of instinct. Men still carried revolvers to bed. Women still glanced over their shoulders in the lamplight. The fear had carved itself into Austin's nightly rhythm. The police, eager to declare victory, hinted that their patrols and arrests had driven out the menace. But few believed them. Too many remembered the incompetence, the false arrests, the endless speculation. The truth was that the city had no answer. The Annihilator had disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived, leaving behind only grief and questions. In a way, that was the cruelest cut of all. There was no trial, no justice, No final assurance that the nightmare was truly over. Only silence, thick, uncertain, and incomplete. When the killings ended, Austin's relief was mingled with disbelief. The city had been scarred too deeply to forget. And in the decades that followed, the Annihilator became a puzzle for investigators, journalists, and historians alike. Each generation offered new theories, but none could close the case. One of the most tantalizing ideas was that the Annihilator had left Austin and resurfaced in London 3 years later as Jack the Ripper. The timing seemed to fit. The murders stopped in Texas in 1886, and the infamous killings began in Whitechapel in 1888. Both killers struck at night, both targeted women, both left wounds described as unusually brutal. The theory made headlines in the early 1900s, and some even suggested that the same man had carried terror across the Atlantic. Yet the evidence was circumstantial, and scholars remained divided. Others proposed more mundane explanations. Some said he had been a vagrant or drifter, a man who passed through Austin during those years and then moved on, leaving no trace of his name. A few pointed to specific men arrested for lesser crimes in Texas or neighboring states, suggesting that one of them might have been the true Annihilator, caught for something small but never tied to his darker deeds. There were also whispers of a cover-up. Some believed the killer might have been a man of influence, perhaps tied to Austin's wealthy circles, and that once suspicion drew too close, his identity was hidden to protect reputations. This theory was fueled by the mysterious way several high-profile suspects were questioned quietly and then released without explanation. Still, others looked inward at the city's divisions. They argued that the inability or unwillingness of law enforcement to solve the crimes stemmed from deep social prejudice. Because the earliest victims were black servant women, the authorities dismissed their suffering until it spilled into white society. By then, it was too late. Every theory carried its flaws, and none brought closure. What they revealed instead was the lingering need to explain the inexplicable, to fill the silence left by a predator who had stepped into Austin's streets, spilled blood, and then vanished into history. As the decades passed, the Servant Girl Annihilator ceased to be an active threat, but he never truly vanished from Austin. His shadow lingered in whispers and in folklore, handed down from one generation to the next. Families told stories at their kitchen tables of nights, when mothers bolted the doors and fathers kept vigil with rifles. Grandparents recalled the fear of hearing footsteps on the porch, or seeing a shadow slip past the lamplight. For many African-American families, the tale was passed with sorrow as well as warning, a reminder of how their community had borne the first and most terrible brunt of the killings. In the city's white neighborhoods, the murders were spoken of more as legend than lived terror. For them, the memory had been softened by distance, retold as cautionary tales for children. Don't stay out after dark, or the Annihilator will find you. Yet beneath the storytelling, the unease remained. By the mid-20th century, historians began to revisit the case. Local archives displayed yellowed newspapers with lurid headlines. Amateur criminologists compared Austin's killings with those of later, more infamous murderers. The name Servant Girl Annihilator began to appear in books, articles, and eventually, tourist lore. Some ghost tours of the city even paused near sites once linked to the crimes, pointing to empty lots where cabins had stood. As if the ground itself remembered, Austin's identity shifted over time. The city became known for its music, its culture, its universities, and its growth. Yet the story of the Annihilator lay just beneath the surface, a reminder that the city's rise to modern prominence had begun in an era scarred by fear. In museums and historical exhibits, the case is sometimes framed as America's first true serial killer story, predating even Jack the Ripper. It is a grim distinction, but one that binds Austin to a broader history of crime and human darkness. What began as horror in the night had, by then, become something else. Memory, myth, and the enduring echo of questions that no one could answer. The story of the Servant Girl Annihilator ends not with a captured suspect or a courtroom confession, but with silence. The murders stopped, and Austin carried on, building new streets, new buildings, and a new reputation. Yet the absence of resolution left something behind, an unease that still lingers in the city's memory. In the century and more since those grim nights, Austin has grown into a city known for light, music, and celebration. But beneath its bright identity lies the reminder of an older truth. that in the winter of 1884 and the summer of 1885, the streets ran with fear. A predator had walked among ordinary people, unseen yet deeply felt, capable of entering homes, dragging women from their beds, and vanishing into the darkness. The Annihilator forced the city to confront the vulnerability of its own promises. The Capitol dome could gleam, the newspapers could boast of progress, but modernity offered no shield against the terror of the night. The killings showed that violence needs no wilderness. It can flourish in the very heart of a city that calls itself civilized. Perhaps that is why the legend has endured. The Annihilator is not just a figure of Austin's past. He is a symbol of how fragile safety truly is, how trust between neighbors can collapse when suspicion takes root, and how the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we would like to believe. When we walk the streets of Austin today, beneath neon lights and festival banners, the thought rarely surfaces. But for those who know the story, the shadows of the past are still there, stretched across the city's history like a dark watermark. The echoes of 1885 remind us that not all monsters are imagined, and that some walk in silence, leaving behind only unanswered questions. The Servant Girl Annihilator was never caught. His true name remains unknown, but his legacy lives on, in every whisper of caution, in every retelling, and in the uneasy truth that sometimes the most dangerous predator is not the beast in the wilderness, but the figure who moves quietly just outside your door.